Let us quiet ourselves in the spirit of prayer. This prayer comes from my colleague, Wayne Arneson. Spirit of life, we have come into each other's presence this day, seeking a part of ourselves, knowing that we do not live alone, and knowing we cannot live fully if we are for ourselves alone. We gather in thanks for the life and ministry of Martin Luther King Jr., not because we worship him as a saint, but because we wish to embody his dream as a possibility that we make real. We gather with full knowledge of our shortcomings, our lives set before us many tasks, and often we are not equal to them. We fall short of our own expectations. We find we do not know enough. We are not always patient. We fall into anger. We cannot find the strength. We lack the vision. We wait in vain for wisdom. It's painful to acknowledge our shortcomings. Yet we are here, Spirit of life. We are here, not always perfect, not always wise, not always just, but wonderfully and mysteriously human and alive. We dedicate this time together to renewing our hope. May the stories we share give us courage. May the songs we sing give us hope. May the words we speak give us wisdom. And most of all, may the touch of hand, the sight of faces, the sounds of voices lifted in song and affirmation restore us in faith that this world may be made whole, with all its people one. We pause in silence, honoring these hopes and aspirations. Amen. Don't worry, Spirit of Life will be back next week. So we have a sermon in 4 parts this morning. I guess it's more like 6 when you add in the introduction and conclusion. 5 years ago, I took a Cambridge adult education class called White People Challenging Racism. The mission of the course was to provide white people with tools to challenge attitudes and actions that perpetuate racism. It is a course for white people because its founders hold the conviction that whites must take responsibility for educating other whites about racism, rather than leaving all this work to people of color. It was a 5-week course during which the dozen or so of us talked openly about the subjects of race, racism, and white privilege. We watched videos, held discussions, and participated in role plays. On the last day of class, we each made an action plan. How were we going to continue our commitment to challenging racism? Everyone had different goals. Speaking up when a family member made a racist joke, inviting people of color to speak on a panel about technology at an upcoming conference, stopping gratuitous racial identifications in the local newspaper's crime reports. Having just taken a course on Martin Luther King in seminary and preaching at that time once a month at the Unitarian Universalist Society of Wellesley Hills, one of my goals was to preach a sermon on the topic of racism. I was nervous to write that goal down and share it with the class. That meant I had to do it. I had some reservations. What if people became defensive? What if I were being offensive? What if, in trying to do the right thing, I said the wrong thing? I also had some questions about what the content of my sermon should be. Would I talk proudly about the work our denomination has done, especially during the civil rights movement, when Unitarian Universalists were a prominent group of activists in both the North and the South? Would I hold up Reverend James Reeb and Viola Luiso, two Unitarians who gave their lives for the civil rights movement? Or would I talk about the empowerment controversy within our denomination, when UU Black leadership of the Black Affairs Council requested funds from the UUA that were not given to them? Would I talk about solidarity, accountability, or personal responsibility? Would I ground my sermon in the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person? In the end, I decided simply to share with my congregation some of the stories that I heard in those classes on racism. And this morning, I share those stories with you. I do this because I would like to offer you what the course offered me: the chance to think about systemic racism and what that means and looks like. Because I had never really been asked to think about racism at that level before. What is most memorable to me about the White People Challenging Racism course and the course on Dr. Martin Luther King is not the videos or books or discussions, although they were valuable. It is the bus rides home. Uncomfortable bus rides, during which I puzzled through the stories I had heard, slowly making connections and changing ways of thinking. The stories to me were confusing and surprising, or maybe not so surprising, but they certainly made me think. So the purpose of this morning's service is not to pat ourselves on the back or to make us feel guilty. It is to honor Martin Luther King, but not only to honor him. The purpose of this morning's service is to make us think. Part of being on a spiritual journey to me is to realize that we are never done learning, never done thinking in new ways. When I was working in Roxbury and doing anti-racism trainings with UUs from all over the Boston area, we would say, try it on. You'll hear some different perspectives today, some new ways of thinking. Try them on. See if they fit. If not, put them down, but try them on. Your social action committee is busy planning anti-racism workshops for the spring that will engage our congregation in conversations about race and privilege and multiculturalism, that will ask us to think deeply and maybe differently about race. I hope you'll join us. And I hope the stories I'll share this morning will open that conversation and deep thinking.
I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. From Letter from Birmingham Jail, April 16th, 1963.
The first story that I share with you is one from ABC's Nightline and their series about race in America called America in Black and White. Commentator Ted Koppel starts out with this thought-provoking introduction. This business of how we perceive the reality of racism in America, he says, depends in large measure on who we are, where we live, how much money we earn, and of course, whether we are black or white. He goes on to introduce a story that made me think more critically about how racism can exist deep within the structures of society, and not just on the visible surface of our personal interactions. About 5 months ago, something happened in Buffalo, New York, he says. It was a traffic accident. I may have been aware of it at the time, he continues, but if I was, it didn't really register. I may have read about it in the paper and then immediately forgot about it. Several of my black colleagues here at ABC heard about the incident and were outraged. This, they argued, was a clear example of the sort of insidious racism that white people rarely notice and almost never acknowledge. Here's what happened. Cynthia Wiggins, a 17-year-old black woman, was hit and killed by a truck on Walden Avenue. The driver who struck her could not tell the color of her skin as she weaved through traffic at a stoplight. In fact, he did not even see her. But the black community of Buffalo rose up incensed at her death, pointing to it as a clear example of racism. The white community equally strongly pushed back. To be honest with you, I think it's ridiculous that racism is even brought into a situation like this, says a white man when interviewed in his local bar. Race is the excuse for everything these days, says a white woman. Anything that happens that's bad, it seems like that's the excuse. But on the other side, Andrew Clark, a friend of Cynthia's and also black, says it's racism, and that's what caused her death. Racism is still alive. Just before a commercial break, Ted Koppel asks, "So why do feelings run so high? Why is there such a difference of opinion, clearly split along racial lines?"
I remember another experience I used to have in Atlanta. I went to high school on the other side of town, to the Booker T. Washington High School. I had to get a bus in what was known as the 4th Ward and ride over to the west side. In those days, rigid patterns of segregation existed on the buses, so that Negroes had to sit in the back of the buses. Whites were seated in the front, and often if whites didn't get on the bus, those seats were still reserved for whites only. So Negroes had to stand over empty seats. I would end up having to go to the back of the bus with my body. But every time I got on that bus, I left my mind up on the front seat. And I said to myself, one of these days, I'm going to put my body up there where my mind is. Martin Luther King Jr. from the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr.
Let's sing again. Our next hymn is number 205, Amazing Grace. Please rise as you are able. Cynthia was a single mom who never graduated from high school. She was from the east side of Buffalo, a rough neighborhood. She was eligible for some public assistance, but needed to get at least part-time work to support herself and her baby. She didn't have a car, but getting to work in her neighborhood was nearly impossible. There were no supermarkets, no hardware store, no family restaurant in that part of town. Hope came in the form of a new mall being built in the nearby suburban neighborhood of Cheektowaga. Many of Cynthia's neighbors, a third of them in fact, took the city bus to work. A half hour on the number 6 bus would get Cynthia to the suburbs, where the jobs were, but not to the new Galleria Mall in Cheektowaga. When the Transit Authority made plans to reroute the number 6 bus by just 1 mile so that East Side residents could access the mall, mall officials and city officials of Cheektowaga made it clear that they did not care to have Route 6 serve the mall. They did not want the problems of the East Side coming to their side. They did not want the Black inner-city community in their mall. A year after opening, the mall agreed to put in a bus stop, but not for the number 6. To reach the Walden Galleria, Cynthia could take the number 6 to the Thruway Mall, a mall with a predominantly Black clientele, and transfer to a shuttle after waiting 30 to 90 minutes. Not a promising option in the frigid Buffalo winters. But Cynthia needed a job, so she took the other option of getting off the number 6 bus at the nearest stop to the Galleria on Walden Avenue, a 7-lane stretch of road, including an on and off ramp to the highway, with no crosswalk or sidewalk. So it was here that Cynthia got off each day for her new job at a fast food restaurant in the Galleria, dodging cars and trucks to cross 7 lanes of traffic. And it was here that Cynthia lost her life when she was struck by an 18-wheeler truck at the intersection as the light turned green halfway through crossing. To some people, maybe even most, the charge of racism here seems like a stretch. But to the Black residents of Buffalo, who already felt like second-class citizens when the mall management actively impeded their access to the new mall, this incident was absolutely related to race. A sanitized, guiltless racism buried under the transportation system and city planning. After Cynthia's death, the bus company and the mall agreed for the need for a new bus stop at the Walden Galleria. Ted Koppel concludes his report by saying, "Passengers of the number 6 bus will no longer have to dodge traffic on Walden Avenue. It is, in a way, Cynthia's legacy."
On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? And vanity comes along and asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of convenience, but where he stands in moments of challenge, moments of great crisis and controversy. And this is where I choose to cast my lot today. Martin Luther King, in his anti-war speech at New York's Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967, when I was 8 years old.
Part 3. This is the true story of Byron Green and Max Holland. They are about the same age, work for the same company, and make the same income. They even live in the same neighborhood. Byron is Black and Max is white. It would seem on the surface that these men are equal in our society. In fact, Byron and Max are the co-directors of California Newsreel, the company that produced the PBS television series Race, The Power of an Illusion, from which I take their story. On the surface, they have the same life, but if you compare their net assets, Max, who is white, has twice as much wealth as Byron, who is black? Why is there such a big difference? Has Byron not worked as hard as Max? Not been as prudent? Did Byron not prioritize his studies and go to a good college? They have the same job. So can we really say that Byron has been discriminated against? What happened? What roles have race and wealth played in their life stories? As we think about this, let's sing our next hymn, number 208, Every Time I Feel the Spirit. Let's get back to Byron and Max. Have you been thinking about why there might be such a big gap in their assets? Let's take a look, starting with when their parents each bought their first homes. In 1951, the Greens bought a 2-story duplex in one of the areas of Chester, Pennsylvania that would rent or sell to African Americans. The Greens scraped together $1,000 for the down payment and mortgaged the $5,500 remaining balance. The Hollands married in 1948, a financial gift from their parents and a low-interest government VA loan allowed the Hollands to stretch their resources and move to a new suburban development on Long Island. In 1952, they bought a home in all-white Merrick for $21,000. Now, let's take a look at how Byron and Max's parents made a living. In the 1950s, job opportunities for black people were still very limited. Mr. Green worked as a lab attendant at a nearby refinery. He'd say black men were the last hired and the first fired. Mrs. Green provided domestic help for white families in the middle-class suburbs. Mr. Holland financed his college education through the GI Bill. After graduating, he got a job as a management trainee for a big New York textile firm where he worked for the next 15 years. The sales, technical, and management staff were entirely white. Byron and Max now live in the same neighborhood. But let's look at Byron and Max's neighborhoods growing up. When manufacturing crashed, many people left Chester, and the area became increasingly segregated. Those who stayed faced higher taxes to maintain public services and schools. While their income remained the same, the Greens saw their expenses climb and their neighborhood begin to deteriorate. Meanwhile, property values were good and getting better for Max's family. He and his brothers enjoyed good schools, parks, and libraries. In 1965, Mr. Holland started his own business by tapping into his home equity and borrowing money from an uncle. His business did well, and he sent all 3 of his children to private colleges. But Byron also went to college. He received an academic scholarship to an Ivy League school. Because of his family's uncertain financial situation, though, he has always exercised a conservative approach to his personal finances. Max's personal wealth building began at the age of 13 with bar mitzvah checks from friends and relatives. By the time he was 18, Max could use his savings and money from his parents to travel, explore his interests, and go to college worry-free. In the year 2000, the Greens sold their home in Chester for $29,000, a negligible increase in value considering the remodeling and improvements they had put into it over 40 years. This amount has not gone far to provide for Byron's parents in old age. At the time of the sale, Chester's population was 76% black. In 1991, the Hollands sold their home for $299,000, 14 times what they paid for it, and were able to retire comfortably to the Berkshire Mountains. They also helped all of their children with down payments on their own homes. At the time of the sale, Merrick was still 95% white. In 1994, Byron financed the purchase of a condominium and continues to make monthly mortgage payments today. He also needs to look after his parents' finances and must be ready to pitch in whenever unforeseen expenses arise. With help from his parents, Max bought his own house in 1985. Today, his parents are financially secure, and his home is all paid for and appreciating value. Max is free to focus on his future, to provide a safety net or launching pad for his own children. As you can see, in one generation, discrimination makes a big difference in the relative wealth of these two people. At the time their story was recorded a few years ago, the average white family had 8 times the wealth of the average non-white family. Even at the same income level, whites have, on average, twice the wealth of black families. Wealth isn't just about luxury. It's also the starting point for the next generation. Until the wealth gap is addressed, say Byron and Max, whites will continue to have an advantage over non-whites, generation after generation.
There again, we hear a lot of talk about the fact that the Negro should lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, I believe in a certain aspect of that, and this is what we try to do. I do always point out the other side, that the problem is that Negroes have not always had the resources in many ways to just do it by themselves. And it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And it's even worse if you have a boot and somebody's standing on the boot and they're telling you to lift yourself by your own bootstraps. Martin Luther King at an Operation Breadbasket meeting in 1967.
So after sharing these stories with you, I don't have any answers to offer, but I do have this feeling of being uncomfortable. And I think that's a start, a step in the right direction. Martin Luther King once said, "Now we should all seek to live a well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic personalities. But there are some things within our social order to which I am proud to be maladjusted, and to which I call upon you to be maladjusted." He continues, "I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to mob rule. I never intend to adjust myself to the tragic effects of the methods of physical violence and to tragic militarism. I call upon you to be maladjusted to such things." And I end with his prayer. God grant that we will be so maladjusted that we will be able to go out and change our world. Amen. And let's end in Song 2. Our closing hymn is number 149, verse 1, "Lift every voice and sing."